Well, for it to be the cause of the universe, and not just some part of it, it would have to be outside of space and time, because it would have created space and time. And for it to have created all of this, it would have to be highly powerful, highly intelligent, highly creative. And so I think where the clue points is towards a cause of the universe that's highly powerful, highly intelligent, highly creative, and outside of space and time. And I think it's hard to think of a better fit for that than God. Think with me about a second feature of the universe that I think points in God's direction. Our universe is remarkably finely tuned for life. Imagine that by this point in the talk, you're unbearably bored. Hard to imagine, I know. You're struggling to stay awake. You're praying that the universe will swallow you in a black hole. And so you take out a deck of cards and you start to play poker with Michelle. And in the first 12 rounds of this poker game, Michelle gets 12 straight royal flushes. What should we think? You should be ashamed of yourself. You see how quick they were to throw you under the bus? Yes, of course, she's cheating. Why? Because even if Michelle is a very honest person, getting 12 straight royal flushes just by chance is so incredibly unlikely that there must be someone messing with the cards. Now, over the last 35 years, the fine-tuning argument has suggested that we should come to a similar conclusion with respect to God. The universe we live in could have taken many different forms. And scientists have approached a consensus, not just Christian scientists, but scientists in general, that there are dozens of fundamental features of our universe that had to be precisely the way they are for life to be possible. Not just life on the planet Earth, not just life as we know it, but any form of life anywhere in the universe. To take just one example, the explosive force of the Big Bang right at the beginning had to be within 1 part in 10 to the 60th of what it was in order for life to be possible. In other words, the percentage difference that you could have while still accommodating the possibility of life is a 0 followed by a period followed by 57 zeros followed by a 1. If the Big Bang had been even the slightest bit weaker, gravity would have caused the universe to collapse back in on itself almost immediately, far too quickly for any form of life to develop. If the Big Bang had been even the slightest bit stronger, then the universe would literally have dispersed into thin air. Particles would have dispersed so quickly and wound up so far from one another that all we could have gotten would have been cold, simple molecules. Nothing like the sort of complex chemistry required for any form of life. That's just one example, and there are many more. The precision necessary for meeting some of these conditions, even on their own, can be compared to being blindfolded and having one shot with a super high-powered gun to hit a 1-inch target on the other side of the observable universe, almost 50 billion light years away, and hitting the target on your first try. Sir Roger Penrose, emeritus professor at Oxford in physics, he suggested that the overall precision necessary for life is less than 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 raised in turn to the power of 123. I would write out that percentage as I did before, but even if I were able to turn all of the matter in the universe into paper, I would still have far too little paper to write the number of zeros that would be required. Sir Fred Hoyle, the Cambridge astronomer, he compared the likelihood of life just on chance to a tornado that would blow through a junkyard and just by chance produce a perfect Boeing 747 airplane. These are the sorts of odds that we're talking about. How are we to explain these amazing coincidences? These royal flushes turning up hand after hand throughout the universe. I think we should come to the same rational conclusion Someone got their hands on the cards and arranged the system. Someone designed the universe. And that someone would have to be old enough to be there at the beginning of the time to set the constants of the universe, powerful and intelligent enough to set them with incredible precision, and that someone would have to have a desire for human life, the sort of life capable of displaying virtue and love and capable of entering into a relationship. The most popular objection to this fine-tuning argument is to say, maybe there's not just one universe, but maybe there are many universes. And if there are many universes, then maybe it's not so surprising that one of them wound up life-friendly. I actually think that's not a very good objection. I don't have time to talk to it right now, but if you are interested, bring it up in the Q&A, and I'll be very happy to speak to it. Many people assume that the advancement of science disproves God. Okay, I did. But I think the reality is very different. Two of the most significant scientific advances in the last century both point very well towards coherence with belief in God. And before I turn over to Ravi, reflect with me for just a couple more minutes on one other fact, one other scientific fact about our universe. A fact that underlies this entire discussion, and that is the regularity of the universe. This is another thing that we just take for granted without realizing how utterly remarkable it is. We just assume that when we wake up tomorrow, the universe is going to carry on in the regular, stable way that it always has. Think about all of the predictions that you need to come true, even in just the next 5 minutes, in order to live an orderly and coherent life. We assume that the objects in our vicinity are going to remain more or less where they are, that gravity is going to continue to do its thing, that atoms and molecules will continue interacting the way they always have, that the color of things is going to remain constant, that the earth will continue spinning, that sound waves will continue to carry the way they always have. Why? Why do we assume that the universe is going to continue to operate with regularity? Now, you might answer me and say, well, it always has in the past. But that's not an answer. That's precisely the question. Why has it always done so in the past? And why should we expect it to continue to do so in the future? If I asked you to reach into a bag full of thousands of M&Ms, sounds pretty good right now. But say there was only one red M&M in this bag with thousands of M&Ms, and I asked you to reach in with your eyes closed and to pull out the single red M&M, you would not give yourself good odds at doing that. Why? Because there are so many other possibilities in the bag that are not red, and there's only one that is red. Well, the same is true when we consider the regularity of the universe. There are all sorts of crazy things that physics could do tomorrow, an infinite number. There are an infinite number of strengths that gravity could take. But there is only one way that it could stay the same, second after second, and day after day, and year after year. Every second we are reaching into that bag blindfolded. And every time, over and over and over, we are pulling out that one red M&M. We are pulling out regularity. We just take for granted that the universe will, of course, continue to operate with regularity. The truth is, that's a great mystery. As Einstein put it, the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. However, if God exists, then we have an explanation for the regularity of the universe. Because the universe is regulated by someone who cares for us deeply, and therefore designed the universe in such a way that we could live orderly and coherent lives that we could find meaning in. I believe God is the best explanation of the regularity of the universe that underlies the entire scientific enterprise. And so not only have I come to not believe that science disproves God, I've actually come to believe that only God proves science. Because only God explains the regularity that underlies all of science. Now, this conversation about the relationship between God and science, God and the universe, it's one that the Bible encourages. It says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made." The Greek word there for "from what has been made" is poemasin. It's where we get the word poem from. And there are two things in the Bible that are spoken of as God's poem. We saw in that last passage that God's creation is spoken of as his poem. And then there's another passage of the Bible that reads, "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." For we are God's handiwork. Another translation says, "For we are his masterpiece." That's the same word, poema, poem. We've been asking the question of whether the universe is the product of chance, undesigned, unintended, without purpose, or whether it is a poem, chosen, carefully crafted, deeply valued. But that is also a question that bears on every part of the universe, including every one of us. Are we, in Quentin Smith's words, from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing? Or are we a poem, uniquely designed by someone who loves us, uniquely designed for a purpose? If God designed the universe with the exact dimensions and the exact parameters and the exact regularity that was needed for you to come to exist, could it also be that he has good plans and good purposes for you that are as carefully, finely tuned as his fine-tuning of the universe? Is there a purpose to your life? Jesus answered yes to that question. He said, "You are designed for a life that is free of anxiety and regrets and shame and guilt, and a life that is absolutely full of love and joy and peace." The same question about the universe is also the question about our lives. Did we come from nothing, and are we headed for nothing? Or did we come from someone, and are we headed to someone? These are, I think, deep and important questions. I'm glad it's just the beginning of the week. It's a privilege to be starting these conversations, and I hope I can talk with many of you throughout the next coming days. I'm thrilled for you to be able to hear from Ravi tonight, not only because of his brilliant mind, but because he always treats everyone he interacts with respect. And I think more than anything, that's why he's been able to help so many people as they've wrestled with the deepest questions of life, and I'm sure that will be the case for you tonight as well. Why don't we welcome Ravi as he comes to speak.
Okay, thanks. All right, am I wired up for sound? If so, I can begin by saying, "Oh, to be young again." It's nice to hear Vince and have him as a colleague. We've authored a couple of books now, and whenever a publisher talks to us about doing it together, I'm always happy to do it because he does the heavy lifting. He just tells me what to do, I try to do it, and then he removes all the errors along the way and sharpens the focus, and you can see why. Thank you for being here tonight, and it's so wonderful to be back here in Arizona. I'm coming from, of all places, Las Vegas. And to see illustrations on cards was fascinating because I've been seeing real card games as we walk by. I'd never been to Vegas before, and just to walk by all of those machines and all of those tables. And in fact, when I got on the plane in Atlanta, the man sitting next to me said, "You're going to Vegas?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "So are you a gambler?" I said, "No, in fact, I'm not a gambler." He said, "Then why are you going there?" I said, "I'm going to speak at a missions conference." Now, if he had taken a bet on why I was sitting next to him, that would not have been the answer he was expecting from me. We had a fascinating conversation all the way. Yeah, it was Muggeridge who said the depravity of man is at the same time the most empirically verifiable, even as it is intellectually unacceptable. We intellectually resist the depravity of man, but empirically we see it all around us and constantly, again and again and again. So I was talking to a man yesterday, and I said, as we were driving out at night, I said, "What is it about Vegas that brings a lot of people here?" He said, "Well, one thing I can tell you about, nobody denies out here that they're really sinners." He said, "The lifestyle just traps you, engulfs you, and the kinds of mistakes that are made along the way." We walked past one table as we were going out, my two colleagues and I, and one man had $30,000 worth of chips on the table that he was going to gamble away. What a pursuit in life. Who knows what he has, who else is involved in this kind of struggle, but so it is. And as Vince has spoken to you about the question of origin, I want to talk to you about three other aspects of life that we all struggle with existentially. Science and faith may have its tension points in terms of beginnings, but existentially we struggle with questions of relevance, meaning, purpose, destiny. We all struggle with it. We all ask these questions. And as I look at the paradigms and the possibilities of life and why we are actually here, I think of what Mark Twain once said. He said, the two most important days in your life are, number one, the day that you were born, and number two, the day that you find out why. Years ago in Vegas, I remember reading an article in the newspapers, a man who'd gone there to have a great time, and it's all around you if you've got the money to buy it. From all the sensualities and luxuries and pleasantries that you want to enjoy. He went there into his fine hotel rooms, one of the finest hotels in the world. And the morning when he didn't open the door to have his room made, they finally broke the door down and found he had taken his life. And on the dresser, he had left just one line, "Here there are no answers." Here there are no answers. I wonder what his questions were. Why did he really go there? The issue of God's existence and non-existence has been the most definitive foundation on which life has been defined. Last year, around this time, the first week of February, actually, I was speaking to the media in Washington. And after I'd finished talking to them on some lines from Dr. Martin Luther King, who refused to believe that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in a river of life. I refuse to believe that we are so tragically bound to the starless midnight of day racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. These are words from his Nobel Prize. And then he said this, "I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality." Unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. Now, if our whole educational system is based on the naturalistic framework and the scientific single vision, where do we find the extensions and implications of truth and love? You see, a scientist may know what happens when he puts A, B, and C together, but science doesn't tell that lab technician that he or she should be truthful in their findings. That comes to a metaphysical or a philosophical, or dare I suggest, a spiritual dimension of why truthfulness should even be held. Unarmed truth and unconditional love. When I finished my talk, a woman from the State Department came up to me and she said, "I have been in the State Department for over 30 years. She said, "Let me tell you something. I have never seen such a toxic frame of mind on Capitol Hill as I'm seeing now. This was a year ago in February. After 3 decades, I've never seen such a toxic mindset of animus, and I hold very little hope for where this is headed. The same can be said today of the racial tensions with which we live. It's been a long while, having now spent half a century of my life in this part of the world, of seeing such intensity of antipathies between people. Take the newspaper, watch the news, and when you go to bed at night, when you turn that television on, you wonder if you can really, with such agitation, put your head down on that pillow and go to sleep. You see, it is ironic, but still not noticed, that at the same time as we have been moving away from absolutes and positing naturalistic frameworks and moving away from the sense of why we are even here, that at the same time we are noticing the antipathies and the hostilities and the lack of answers in our world. Can we really connect the dots? Can we not see that if there's no up and down, how are we going to settle the issues between right and left? And that's all we hear. Right, left, liberal, conservative, extreme is this, extreme is that. If we don't get the vertical dimension of why we are here, what it means to be human, that is the definitive starting point of why I speak to you and why I give to you the respect and the reverence and treat you as a person not of extrinsic worth given by society or by state, but intrinsic worth by the very created order. And so unconditional truth, unarmed truth and unconditional love are real pursuits. And I've often wondered if Dr. King were around today and he looked at what is happening, what he would say about his hope, whether it's being shattered or whether he would still, like a man holding on to one slender string on a violin, believe there can still be music if we can only know how to put it into the hands of the great musician. And so I want to deal as quickly as I can with the paradigm. Vince was dealing with scientism and hedonism and pluralism in the book. I dealt with atheism, humanism, and relativism. So let me just take the atheistic framework, since more and more it is becoming a paradigm for life, especially because of the likes of the Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and so on. The several other authors of recent vintage have been writing in that quite vociferously and quite confidently. Between 1844 and 1900, there lived a man who was the son of a pastor, and both of his grandfathers were in the ministry. But somewhere along the way, with his lifestyle and so on, it's not too certain with his biographical data, but the idea is that somewhere, some biographers believe he'd contracted venereal disease, and ultimately in the last 13 years of his life spent moving between sanity and insanity. I'm talking about the brilliant man and the brilliant mind of Friedrich Nietzsche. So raised in this parsonage, and both of his grandfathers, both sides were in the ministry, but he chose to reject God and popularize the phrase, God is dead. But I want you to notice the honesty and candor with which he asked the implications of his own conclusions. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, who ran into the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God, I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him then, said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? So he shouted and shouted, and they laughed him, and he was laughed to scorn. But the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how did we do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling backwards and forwards, sidewards and in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods do decompose, and he is dead. He remains dead, and we have killed him. But how did we, the murderer of all murderers now, how do we compose ourselves? That which was holiest and mightiest of all the world has possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games will we now need to invent? Is this not the greatest of all deeds, too great for us? Must we not now ourselves have to become God, simply to seem worthy of what we have done? There's never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us for the sake of this deed will be part of a larger history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent, and again regarded his listeners. They too were silent, and they stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke and went out. I come too early, maybe. My time has not yet come. This event will take time. And lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars require time. Deeds require time. This deed is still more distant from them than the distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. It's been related further on the same day that the madman entered diverse churches and there sang a requiem, Eternum Deo. Let out and quieted, he is said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now, if they are not the tombs of a dead God and the sepulchre of a dead God? I remember in my few days at Cambridge, my professor of philosophy, Don Cupid, who was one-time Anglican priest turned atheist. And he would look out of the window and point to some of the spires there in that beautiful King's Parade in Cambridge. And he would point it and say, this is what we once believed. We no longer can bring our minds to believe it. And ironically, he was an Anglican minister turned atheist. My professor of quantum was John Polkinghorne, who was an atheist turned Anglican minister, and now travels around speaking one of the leading quantum physicists of his time. Two opposite conclusions, two brilliant minds. What happens if you bury God and God is dead? Notice what Nietzsche said. Must not lanterns now have to be lit in the morning hours? Is there any up or down left? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the horizon? What sacred games will we need to invent? How did we accomplish this deed? He knew that nature abhorred a vacuum, and something would have to come rushing in. We'd have to invent something. And so Professor Royal Rue in one of his books talks about the fact that we have to invent a noble lie, something that is beautiful, even though we know it is not true. Because we need the sacred, he says. We need these issues of love and mercy and grace and all. We must get them back. And since God is dead, let's invent a lie and find them back. He said the problem with Christianity is that it was a beautiful lie. We no longer believe it. We have to come up with a noble lie now to take its place. What is the struggle that is going on behind all of this? The first major struggle, especially in our pluralistic society, which I'm wondering what it'll take America to wake up to. Where are we going to find a moral law? Where are we going to find our absolutes? In an intentionally pluralistic society, is that not almost a given impossibility? How do you find a moral absolute without violating what somebody else claims is his or her absolute? This is the struggle with which we live. Kai Nielsen, the Canadian atheist, put it this way: we have not been able to show as atheists that reason requires the moral point of view, or that really rational persons unhoodwinked by myth or ideology, need not be individual egoists or classical amoralists. Reason doesn't decide here. The picture I am painting for you is not a pleasant one for me. Reflection on this actually depresses me. Pure, practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. This is an atheist talking. Pure, practical reason will not take you to morality. Bertrand Russell admitted that even though he lived in that naturalistic framework, he could not live as though ethical values were merely a simple matter of personal taste, and he found his own views quite incredible, he says. Those were his words. I find my own views quite incredible. I do not know what the solution is. Richard Rorty says this: if moral imperatives are not commanded by God's will, and if they are not in some sense absolute, then what ought to be is a matter simply of what men and women decide should be. There is no other source of judgment. Nietzsche himself made the comment, when we killed God, ethics died. When one gives up the Christian faith, one pulls the right to Christian morality out from under one's feet. This morality is by no means self-evident. Christianity is a system, a whole way of viewing things thought out together. By breaking its main concept, the faith in God, we break the whole. It stands or falls with faith in God. This is Friedrich Nietzsche talking. That was his quote. I had the privilege of spending time with Malcolm Muggeridge just about 7 months before he died. It was always a longing of my life to meet the man. I don't know if there was a more brilliant linguistic expert in journalism in Britain than him. It's a toss-up, they say, between him and G.K. Chesterton. But as we spent that whole afternoon together enjoying a lunch, we were walking together, and he was talking to me about his time in Russia, especially watching what Joseph Stalin had done, and the hours that he spent with Svetlana Stalin on the production of the BBC production on the life of Joseph Stalin. And we were talking about it. He said, you know, he was a believer in God at one time. I said, yes, I'm aware of it. And then he lost his faith in God. And if you read Paul Johnson's Modern Times and see the biographical sketch, it's quite incredible how he made that dramatic switch from a theistic framework to an atheistic framework. And Muggeridge told me the story. I see it is also told by Paul Johnson, verified by Svetlana and several others. A foreign visitor came to visit Stalin. He was not a very big man. Stalin was not his real name. It was a nickname because he was a man of steel, having obliterated 15 million of his own people. And the foreign visitor comes to see him. And at one point she says to him, how do you expect to be so cruel to your own people and expect them to still be following you? Stalin didn't answer her. He asked for the waiter to bring a live chicken. He took the live chicken and started to denude it, pull the feather out one at a time as the chicken was wincing, trying to break free from his clutches. He completely denuded the chicken, put the chicken down on the floor, picked up a piece of bread and walked away. And the chicken hobbled over towards him and nuzzled between his trouser legs. He bent down with the bread in his hand and started to peck away. He said, madam, have you got your answer? People are like the chicken. You torture people and they will follow you for the rest of their lives. I have tortured this chicken. It will follow me for food the rest of its life. Even Lenin, when he saw what was happening in Stalin's mind and the complete devaluation of human life, warned that he may be one of the most deadliest people that the Russians ever had as a leader. His paradigm shift. Now here's what I want to say to you. Yes, when Christendom was in control, the church didn't do a very good job either. It was tough on people, it was hard on people, and any time religion is politicized, it destroys both the political system and what true religion is meant to be. So that's not the point. The point is this: Stalin was working with a logical outworking of his own belief. When Christendom was cruel towards people, it was working illogically in contradiction to what the teaching of Christ was, who always took the victim, the poor, the exploited, and put them as the centerpiece of the one to whom he really was wanting to show the greatness and the grandeur of his love. And so to atheism, I think the biggest challenge, where do we turn for an absolute in our pluralistic society? See, I come from a land of India, over 1 billion people, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of deities. For centuries, they believed in the ethos of what human life was all about, and hence the greeting with reverence and respect. You go back to China, do you know, when I talk to Chinese politicians at the highest level, do you know what they tell me? We want ethics taught in China again because we lost our foundation for it. I've lectured at Tsinghua University, which is one of the most prestigious Chinese universities. What do they want me to speak on? Where do we find an ethic? Where do we find an ethic? They lived out that atheistic worldview in Mao Zedong and the murder, the slaughter of tens of millions. They don't know where to turn for an ethic. And that's why a philosopher of ethics has said ours is an age where ethics has become obsolete. It is superseded by science, deleted by psychology, dismissed as emotive by philosophy. It is drowned in compassion, evaporates into aesthetics, and retreats before relativism. The usual moral distinctions between good and bad are simply drowned in a maudlin emotion in which we feel more sympathy for the murderer than for the murdered, for the adulterer than for the betrayed, and in which we have actually begun to believe that the real guilty party, the one who somehow caused it all, is the victim and not the perpetrator of the crime. So when people like Sam Harris and all talk about, their theory of finding an ethic in well-being and all, it's the same old stuff rehashed again and again. But when you read the poets of old, right from the Romantic poets, they said, if naturalism is true, nature is red in tooth and claw. Nature is red in tooth and claw. And we are here by the bequest of that kind of thinking. Christ contradicts that. And so many of us become afraid of the good in what Christ has to offer, for the moral law is given to us beginning with the very character and nature of God and the value that he places upon every one of us individually. Secondly, and quickly, the struggle for a moral law. Secondly, the search for meaning. Where do we find meaning? How do we find meaning? What does meaning really mean? When we talk about a search for meaning, I put it down to 4 components that we really implicitly or explicitly are looking for. Wonder, the sense of enchantment. Last night our hosts, we very, very rarely do this because our time is so busy, and I really needed to fly to be here, but I want to be courteous, so we stayed. And we went to the Cirque du Soleil show. Never seen one before. What spectacular technological demonstration. Brilliance. Unbelievable. You're in awe with what the artist can really do, not only with rhythm and with music, but in the spectacular nature of it. It's enchanting. It's the search for wonder that we all find again and again. And you look at a little child in the early days, all it takes is something that moves and it's wow. And then as the days go by, more and more, that wide-eyed reaction till ultimately as young adults, what is it that really wows us? And we long for that mystery and beauty and splendor of what love is all about. We've lost it in our time. Let me just give you 2 quick illustrations of this. My little grandson Jude, who's 4 or 5 now, I better be right here or I'm in trouble. And at the age of 3.5, he's 5 now, at the age of 3.5, his mother had lost her car keys in the house, my daughter Naomi. She's a tiny little thing. And she slapped her forehead and she says, I'm losing my mind. I think I'm losing my mind. And this little kid, 3.5 years old, comes and plants himself in front of her. And he says, Mommy, whatever you do, don't ever lose your heart because I'm in there. Who told him to say that? Who taught him to say that? And you look at those tiny little lives, they find their entire meaning in belongingness. And that's why when Jesus was asked to illustrate the kingdom, he didn't go to a philosopher, he didn't go to a rabbi, he didn't go to a lawyer, he didn't go to a tax collector. He pointed to a little child and said, unless you become like one of them, neither shall you enter into the kingdom of heaven. Because they combine those two splendor-filled excellencies of simplicity and sublimity. The simple and the sublime. And the second illustration I give to you is this. This May, my wife and I will be celebrating 45 years of married life. I've been an itinerant. Actually, you should applaud her, not me. 45 years of itinerant life, more than half of which is spent on the road. And one of the reasons I'm taking an early morning flight tomorrow about 5 or so a.m. is because my daughter and my daughter-in-law are celebrating their birthday, and I said, I just have to be there. I have to get back. And as I look back of all the marvelous experiences I've had in life, of seeing practically so much of the world, and being with people of great power and influence, I still find my fulfillment in coming back home where I know I am loved without any credentials claimed. You are accepted for who you are, not what you are. Bertrand Russell said his greatest regret in life was that he never ever found love in his life. If you read the biography of Ernest Hemingway, same thing. He lost his way. Brilliant man, brilliant writer. Wasted away in his last few years, pining without even being able to express physical intimacy. How did God design us? He designed us with a hunger for love and belongingness, and love has its boundaries. Free love is a contradiction in two words. There's no such thing as free love. Love was never intended to be free, said Chesterton. It is the nature of love to bind itself. Where do we get that from? We get that in the Judeo-Christian worldview. The atheists will struggle to define what love is and why love needs to be. So morality and love, and lastly, the question of hope. You've got the destiny that we all look for, the longing that we all have. My own colleague, Nabil Qureshi, is only in his mid-30s, and a brilliant guy. Last year found out he had stage 4. I was having lunch with him one day. I said, Nabil, it's not like you, you're not eating. He always calls me uncle. He said, Uncle, I don't know what's going on. He said, I'm having strange feelings in my stomach. I said, are you doing anything about it? He said, well, I just thought it was just indigestion or whatever, but I'm going to get some tests. And within 2 weeks, he found out stage 4 cancer of the stomach in his early 30s. I went and spent some time with him a few weeks ago, and we went and had lunch. I had a hard time not crying looking at him, robust, strong, but with a young baby now and a wife having to face death. Is there any hope? But there's a subtle aspect of hope that I want to talk about that we don't think about often. What is the young millennial crying for more than anything else in our time? Justice. We want justice. We want justice. We want a just society. If there is no eternity, where are you going to find justice? Are you really going to find it in your 70 years and 10? You don't see it. You simply don't see it. Time and time again you see things happening and you say, this is unjust. This is wrong what is happening. But the Bible describes God as the judge of all the earth. And he says, shall not the judge of all the earth do what is right? If you're playing a game and you lose because somebody has cheated, you really get upset. Not just because you lost the game, but because you lost it when somebody made a lie to seem like the truth. I was talking to one, John Smoltz, the great pitcher for the Atlanta Braves. He's pitched for us for many years, a good friend of mine, and we've been friends for many years. So we were talking some time ago. I'd finished speaking to the Braves at a chapel. And, he said to me, I said, what's the most difficult part of your life, John? He said, well, the training, the training. You never live without that hanging over your head. He said, but I've also found out something else. He said, when I stand on that mound, I have to make 100 good decisions that night. He says, and he named one of the players who said was the most difficult one to pitch against. He said, when we were playing against that team, I would be tossing and turning in bed that night. What is the kind of pitch I'm going to give to him when he does come up to the plate? And he said, as I would struggle on the mound, what am I going to throw him? What am I going to throw him? A, B, C, D, and go through. He said, then you find out he was taking all these artificial supplements and stuff like that to become brilliant. He says, you don't know how angry that makes me, he said. That you're sweating bullets on the mound, trying to figure out what to throw this boy. And you find out at the end of it that he's been taking all this artificial supplements to be able to outwit you. And men all of a sudden look pretty low down when they are doing that to them. That's only a game. Think of life. Why are we debating the refugee issue? Because we want to choose between compassion and what's right, and safety and what's going to be a risk. We don't want to be caught on the wrong foot here. And so I say to you, the Bible reminds you and me that He's made us for a purpose. I have made you for myself, says God. And Augustine says He's made us for Himself, and our hearts are restless until they come find their rest in Thee. So we've got origin, meaning, morality, destiny. These are the 4 questions of life. And let me just close with this. How are we going to find the answer? How are we going to find the answer? And the answer really has to be found in the true admitting of who we are in our hearts. Who we are. I remember speaking to a Muslim cleric, a very fine gentleman in Syria, Sheikh Hussein. We had a 3-hour dialogue before an audience, one of the nicest gentlemen I'd ever met. We had the interpreter between us. We had a cordial conversation. He was the leading Shia cleric in Damascus. Always would refer to me as professor, wanting to have a cup of tea with me, wanting to take me out for this and that. And then after we finished our dialogue, the way the dialogue went, I would ask him one question about his faith, he would answer it. He would ask me one question about my faith, I would answer it, and the audience would respond with questions. At the end of it, he looked around, the interpreter, and he said to me, Professor Zacharias, he said, I think the time has come for me to say this. We have to stop asking if Jesus died on the cross and start asking why. I said, may I quote you, sir? He said, yes, you may. Why? Why is the cross the centerpiece of the Christian story? Is because the problems that we face in the world are not around us, they're in here. And until the heart is transformed individually, we will never see peace externally. My peace I give to you, says Jesus, not as the world gives. And He gives that by the transformation of the heart. You look at atheism, the struggle to find a point of reference morally, struggle to find the source for love, and a struggle to even find how to move towards justice. Because if there is no ultimate hope, there is really no ultimate justice. Vince dealt with origin. I've brought you morality, meaning, and destiny. Those are the 4 points which frame your worldview. And we believe firmly it's in Jesus Christ that worldview is framed with coherence and correspondence. God bless you. Thank you for giving me hearing.
So I have got a first question that has come, and actually this will be the only question tonight that we're posing specifically to one person, and this is because of Vince inviting these questions at the front of his talk. So this question is to you, Vince. We're going to just set you up since you asked for it.
I invited that question for Ravi.
You know.
Actually. Yeah.
And here is the question. It's going to come up on screen, actually. Vince, what is your objection to the multiverse theory?
Great. So thanks for asking that question. And feel free to come and talk to me further about it afterwards as well. Here's my thinking about the multiverse objection. And just to remind everyone, because not everyone may spend most of their days thinking about multiverses, the objection is, let's say there are many universes and not just one. If that's the case, then maybe it's not so surprising that one of those universes, just by chance, wound up friendly for life. And so maybe we don't have to conclude that God designed the universe. Maybe it just came about by chance, but there are many universes and one of them wound up friendly for life. The first thing that I would say in response to that is that although we have a hypothesis from some that there are many universes, we don't have compelling evidence where we actually have that conclusion. However, let's just assume for the sake of argument that someone was able to show you that yes, there are in fact many universes. I still don't think that objection works, and here's why. I said initially that Michelle was playing poker. Let's say Michelle was playing poker with my colleague Thomas. She got 12 straight royal flushes. We all said she cheated. She turns to me and says, "No, Vince, you've got it wrong. Wait, I didn't cheat. What you don't know is that actually me and Thomas play poker all day, every day. And we have for the last 20 years. We've played many, many, many hands of poker." If Michelle told me that, and if I had reason to believe her, should I change my conclusion about her cheating? And the answer is that I shouldn't. And the reason is because she hasn't told me anything about what happened in all of those other hands of poker. For all we know, she's been getting 12 straight royal flushes several times a day for the last 20 years, just further confirming the hypothesis that she has cheated. So we can't actually show that there's a multiverse, but even if we could show that there's a multiverse, we certainly can't show what all those other universes are and whether or not those universes are friendly to life. So the multiverse is neutral between the hypotheses. For all we know, if there are many other universes, maybe many of them are friendly for life, and that would just further confirm the fact that there's a designer. One of our colleagues, John Lennox, actually once quipped when he was asked, "Do you think there are many universes? Do you think there's a multiverse?" And he said, "I've heard rumors that there's a heaven." So we have a powerful creative God. Maybe he's created very interesting things, but maybe those things would be friendly to life as well. Those are a couple thoughts on the multiverse, but happy to talk more about it after.
Great, thank you so much. And we want to go ahead and prioritize the question from the floor right now.
On the idea of, like, if there is no, like, moral ground, is having a moral ground or making up that divine lie a sense of controlling everyone here? Like, if we were to all believe one law or lie, it's almost a method of control. Having a pluralistic society in which everyone can believe different things is a sense of freedom, and by taking that away, you are chaining yourself to that lie. And so I was wondering what you thought about that.
Great question. Am I right for sound here? By the way, I remember asking John Polkinghorne that same question about a multiverse theory. And then, typical Englishman, he had just one line. He said, "Let's be sure what we are talking about. Pure speculation." That's it. That was his answer in the whole room. He just didn't even want to move into any other discussion on something that was so speculative. Your point is well taken, and it can be. The fact is that, may I stand? It's easier on my back if I stand. I've often said that when you talk about morality and culture, there are three types of cultures in which we live with morality. One is called a theonomous culture, where we assume that the moral law of God has been poured into our hearts in such a way that there's a homogeneity to our thinking, not to kill, not to lie, not to steal, and all of that. In the earlier days, they would call that common law, and we would talk about that as a theonomous culture, theos, God, nomos, law. We don't really believe in that anymore. We don't believe too many truths to be self-evident. So then we go to a heteronomous culture. A heteronomous is really the kind that you're talking about here, where a handful at the top will dictate it to the masses below and control them by that. Some religions follow that heteronomous, heteros meaning another, and nomos meaning law. There's another law being enforced upon us, and across history, virtually every religion has abused that privilege and punished its people for it. So we don't lean towards a theonomous or a heteronomous culture. We lean towards, as Christians, what is an autonomous autos meaning self, and nomos meaning law. In the beginning of the created order, there was only one prohibition, not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. However you want to explain that, what it boils down to is this: don't play God. Don't become the definer of good and evil. And in the day that you start autonomously defining good and evil, you actually end up playing God and end up enforcing your law upon everybody else, and you move towards heteronomy or some kind of theonomy. When Jesus came into this world, the law keepers were very tough. They were tough on society. They wanted to kill the one in adultery. They wanted to make the Samaritan the outcast. And it is fascinating how he took those outcasts and put them at the centerpiece of his illustration to show us that we could not use law to obliterate their humanity and bring instead mercy and grace to it. So when the Bible talks about Moses coming with the law and Jesus coming with truth and grace, what God has given to you and me is the prerogative of our choice and our self-determination. If I use my law with which to enchain somebody else and enforce it in ways that they do not want it, then I'm using it the way that you're talking about. God gives us the freedom to choose or not to choose, but he does not give us the freedom to change the consequences of that choice. The entailments follow for that choice. You cannot choose A and ask for the consequence of B. A has its logical entailments and its logical outworkings. So that's why we are free to choose, but we cannot be free to choose alternative consequences, because there is a logical connection between the choice and the entailments. That, I believe, is the difference in the Judeo-Christian worldview, which gives you the freedom to believe or not to believe, but it does not give you the freedom to change the consequences that are linked to the choice made.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
The next question we're going to take has been texted in, and it is, how do we see justice play a role in eternity?
Go ahead, Vince. You're good.
I'll say something and jump in, Ravi. It's one of the things that's most attractive to me about the Christian faith. Pascal, one of my favorite theologians, he said we should convince people first that Christianity is attractive and then show them that it's true. Both of those things are important, the truth of it and the beauty of it. And anyone who has been wronged, anyone who has wronged someone else knows the importance of justice. And as I was looking at that question, I was especially reminded of a conversation that I had with someone who had something truly horrendous happen to a family member of theirs, and asked the question, if this person accepts Jesus, if this person becomes a Christian, how could I live with that person in eternity who did that terrible thing to my family member? And my immediate thought was to say there's a significant sense in which you won't. Because one of the promises of Jesus is that when he comes into our lives, he actually gives us a new heart. And so there's a really significant sense in which someone becomes a new creation. And the reason you're able to live together with people who have even wronged you is partly because when you engage with them and meet them and interact with them, and I've seen this in my own life, you can truly say that this is a different person, because there's a God who's powerful enough to actually give someone a new heart. This question of justice is so important, and so often, I think, in our culture, we don't like to talk about the word sin. It's kind of a taboo word, and we like to think that we're pretty good. We like to compare ourselves. I know my tendency is to compare myself to whoever's done the worst thing on the 6 o'clock news, and in comparison to them, I look pretty good. A few years ago, I received news that someone who I can remember as a teenager at a point in my life where I could care less about God or morals, someone who I was mean to, someone who I took every opportunity to put down, and I received news that that person had taken their life, had killed themselves. And there's a verse in the Bible that says, "For the wages of sin is death." I had read that dozens of times. That never really sunk in until I heard that news, and I started asking questions like, well, would that have been the case if I had offered my hand to help that teenage boy rather than to push him down? Would he have taken his life? And I don't know the answer to that question. So often we can't see those ripple effects of our actions. We also can't see them from the perspective of God himself. You know, I can look back on times in my life when at the time what I thought I was doing, I thought it's no big deal. That's just the sort of thing teenagers do. It's just the sort of thing you do in college. Now I can look back on some of those things and recognize them for what they truly were and recognize that there was real evil in some of those things. If I've moved along this path of morality, it's minimally so. Imagine how some of it looks from God's perspective. Imagine how far along this path he would be. Jesus gives us some sense of what it looks like. He says that lust looks like adultery. He implies that unjust anger looks like murder itself. Getting back to this question, I think every one of us, certainly I've found in my life, we have a problem in that we do need forgiveness. We have done things where there should be just penalty for what we've done, where a loving God would not say to the people that we've wronged, you know what, it's just no big deal. It's no big deal. We're just going to let that slide. A loving God would be committed to justice for those who have been wronged, but a loving God would also have that unconditional love for every single person, for you and for me, for everyone who has done something wrong in their life. So what does that look like in the context of eternity? I think the Christian faith is the only faith in where you can hold on fully to both this love and this justice, because you have a God who loved us so much he would come down, and on the cross he takes on himself all that justice that is required so that he can extend that unconditional love and mercy to every single person. You have perfect love and perfect justice in perfect intersection at the cross. And that, I think, is perhaps the best summary of the Christian faith, and something I don't think you find in any other worldview, and one of the reasons why you truly can say that there's both justice and love in the context of eternity in the Christian faith.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to go to another live question right now.
Hi there. My question is for both of you, because I want to get both of your takes on this. What reasons are there for believing in any deity if by nature we can't prove it exists? And more specifically, why do you believe that Christianity is the one that worships this deity correctly?
I could go either way, start with either of them. Let me give you a quick take on the first part of it and the second take on the person of Christ. And by the way, it's a great question. I think it's the most defining question and probably the most important question you're ever going to ask in life. More consequences for your life will follow from that than anything else. 3 quick stages for the first question. No matter how you cut down physical, concrete reality, no matter how you section it down, no quantity in this world explains its own existence. It has to ultimately go outside of itself to explain its existence. That's the first thing. Number 2, wherever you see specified complexity, wherever you see design and the whole purpose of organization, and hence you've got the whole expression of Frederick Hoyle that it would be like a tornado going through a junkyard and producing a jumbo 747. That if we are all demonstrably contingent and dependent and cannot explain our own existence. Number 2, wherever you see specified complexity, you always assume a designer. If I were to argue for you that a dictionary developed because of an explosion in a printing press, you would never buy that because of the complexity of it. So in our experience, we are contingent. We have not caused ourselves. In our experience, we see design, we always have to point to a designer. And number 3, if you look at the very person and work of Jesus Christ. And so let me take the last part of it as the most important one on why I believe Jesus Christ to be the only way. When you take the 4 questions of life, of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, and put the 2 categories for truth, correspondence and coherence, and take the 3 tests for truth, logical consistency, empirical adequacy, and experiential relevance. You've got 1, 2, 3. All right? The fact of truth, the correspondence, coherence theories of truth, logical consistency, empirical adequacy, experiential relevance. You put the questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny to any worldview, any of the major religious worldviews, you will find only in the teaching of Jesus Christ that you find there is a correspondence to reality and a coherence to his answers. I don't want to get into other worldviews here and try to put some of them down, but let me just take one simple explanation, for example, on the death of Jesus Christ and the cross. If you go to the Islamic worldview, they will answer your question on how you attain paradise. And the answer is your good deeds have to outweigh your bad deeds. That's classic Islamic doctrine. If you go to the Gita or the Mahabharata or the Hindu scriptures, and you ask them, how do you attain nirvana? The answer is in the payment of your karma. You always have to pay. Whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, all pantheistic worldviews, one thing they all believe in is the karmic law of cyclical, every birth is a rebirth, and every birth pays for the previous one. When you go through that very issue, from whether it's Islam or whether it's a pantheistic worldview, and you come to the teaching of Jesus Christ and the centrality of the cross, both of those worldviews, all of those worldviews, are ultimately looking for grace and forgiveness, but they're not offered. They're not offered. I wrote a book on an imaginary conversation between Krishna and Jesus and new birth or rebirth. And if you read the Gita, for example, one of the things that Krishna is talking about is the sacrifice. We need the sacrifice. We need the sacrifice. And I've asked Hindus on that, have you found it in there? And the answer is no. So when you talk of grace and forgiveness, which of us doesn't need it? We all need grace. We all need forgiveness. And that's why I believe the cross to be the centerpiece. So Jesus describes my human condition. He provides for my malady. And in the perfection of his life and the resurrection from the dead, you see that coherence and correspondence that is not found anywhere else in any other worldview teaching. In fact, the questions we ask make Jesus' answers look even more persuasive and more compelling, because those are the very things we look for. And if you take the simple passages of Scripture from the John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life, a handful of words, just a handful of words. The beginning is filial. We have a relationship. The reception is conditional. Whosoever believes in him. The range is eternal, but behind it all, it's legal. There is a moral law at work. And that is provided for in the gospel story. So when you move to the contingency of our existence, the specified complexity of our existence, and the historic demonstration of the person and work of Christ, and you see the answers of Jesus, you take the question of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny, apply the tests of truth. He's the only one who answers the questions with correspondence and coherence. I'm absolutely convinced of that as one who has studied world religions for most of my life now, but I'll also like Vince to put a footnote to that if you care to. Yeah.
Sure. So I'll just try to keep my answer brief, but just share it with you by way of saying a bit about my story. I was first challenged to begin reading the Bible in college by some friends I had made on the soccer team I was playing on, and when I began reading through, I would cross things out and add things, and I used to write a big BS in the margin wherever I disagreed, not to denote good passages for Bible study, unfortunately. I continued reading, and I got past the Gospels about Jesus' life, and I got into the book of Acts, and I started seeing all these words about persuading and convincing and debating and even proving And I realized that this is a faith that was intellectual. The followers of Jesus were standing there and debating people from all different worldviews. And then I read that it said God provided confirmation for all by raising Jesus from the dead. And then I continued to read on, and I got to a book called 1 Corinthians, written to the Corinthian church. And in the 15th chapter of that, come see me afterwards. If you don't have a Bible, would love to show you this passage. And there's a passage at the beginning of that chapter that gives a summary of all the people who have claimed to see Jesus and spend time with him after he was risen from the dead. The remarkable thing about this passage is it claims many people, it claims hundreds of people have seen him in different places at different times, friends and enemies, and the scholars today, not just Christian scholars, but scholars generally, they accept that that passage is an early creed that predates the book and goes back to very close to the events themselves, meaning that there was no time for a sort of legendary development hypothesis that somebody might have thought was the case 100 years ago. I started reading this, and I started to ask the question, what can explain that? What can explain the fact that there appears to have been hundreds of people who were walking around very shortly after Jesus' death? And this is very unique to Christianity, that we can actually look into this historically. And what explains the fact that there were all these people who were utterly convinced they had spent time with this man after his death, and they were even willing to give their lives for it, though they were being persecuted for the claim. And I got in touch with two of the top New Testament professors at Princeton, and I sat down with each of them individually and said, look, I'm doing this research into this. I wasn't at all convinced, but here's the data I'm coming up with. I don't know how to explain it. How do we get from what should have been the movement-ending death of Jesus on the cross to all of a sudden the absolute eruption of Christianity and all of these people walking around saying, I've spent time with this man after his death and I'm willing to die for it? I can see how a miraculous resurrection would explain that. But if that doesn't, what else does? And one of them glanced without conviction towards a mass hallucination theory, which is riddled with problems and doesn't have any degree of credibility in the literature. The other one told me that as a historian, he simply wasn't interested in the question. And I think the assumption was that as soon as we begin to start to talk about the miraculous, we're no longer talking about history. And I've never understood why he felt he could just make that assumption before actually having the conversation. So I would just say, look into that, because you have a historical gap there. Jesus' death, his followers thought that he was this Messiah who was going to become an earthly king and reign forever, and then he died. That should have been the end of the movement. And then you had this absolute eruption of Christianity. There's a historical gap there, no matter who you are. Christians bridge that gap with the resurrection. If you don't, that's okay. But what else can go in that gap? And I've found, and many have found through historical study, that the only plausible way of bridging that gap historically is to say that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So it's one of the things that I love about Christianity. When I first began to look into the faith, I was worried that it would mean I would have to put my brain at the door. I would have to take a blind leap of faith. I knew that was something that I couldn't do. But what I've actually found is that this is a faith that you can dig into historically, philosophically, scientifically, morally, and it's one that provides rich answers. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you both so much. I've just been told that we have time for 2 more questions. We're going to take one more live question from the floor, and then we'll close with one of the texted questions. So go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, just I want to state something. I myself am Christian, and this question is for Ravi. It's kind of just a challenge, like the atheistic worldview, because I want to know specifically, why do atheists hold on to things as love, truth, justice, and morality, if according to their evidence, they've came from fish, bacteria, and matter? Why does that matter to them?
The last statement said, why does it matter? Is that what you say?
Yeah, why does it matter to them?
Okay. Well, I was very much, I don't know if I would call myself a loud atheist. I was a non-theist. I never believed in it. Because when you grow up in a land with so much religion, you begin to treat them all as sort of equally respectable, but not really truthful. I lived for cricket. I lived for the sports field. My parents took me to church, and I memorized the Anglican prayer book only so that I could time it to know when it would end. That's the way I did that. As soon as the vicar would say, "Let us therefore draw near by faith," I knew I had 7 minutes left and we'd be out of there. I had no interest in that. And at the age of 17, I was on a bed of suicide. I tried to take my own life. I lived in a culture where shame is a very powerful emotion, and I wasn't doing very well. My father was hard on me. And so in trying to take my life, that Bible was brought to my room. And I couldn't hold it because my body was dehydrated. I had tried to poison myself, and the moisture was all expelled, and I was literally rushed to the hospital in emergency. They didn't think I was going to make it. And Jesus' words to me were read. Jesus said, "Because I live, you also shall live." Neither of my parents knew anything about what that meant. My life was so transformed, and the biggest thing I found after that transformation and trusting Christ at the age of 17, that all of my friends were absolutely flummoxed by this. They didn't know how to explain it. My father didn't know how to explain it. My mother didn't know how to explain it. After a while, they both made their commitments to Christ. But what I noticed was this, to answer your question. That which I longed for was now given legitimate expression. My questions seemed like they were just vaporous questions. Why am I longing for love? Why do I want truth? Why do I want meaning? Why, after I bury loved ones, do I have to walk away saying, "This is it, it's all gone and it's over with"? And in India, the life expectancy is not that high. I remember burying so many of our relatives, one after another, and my mother died when she was in her 50s. My dad shortly after that. Fortunately, by then I had come to know Christ. But why do they talk about justice? Why do they talk about love? Because they are existentially inescapable categories that demand to be believed in if life is to be coherent. Otherwise, life is completely incoherent. Not only is there, why do we come to university? We are supposedly looking for unity and diversity. That's what the university is all about. And when we've lost the unity and diversity, and there's no queen of the disciplines anymore to give us our moral reasoning, it is fascinating what Gertrude Himmelfarb from Columbia University in her book Roads to Modernity says. She says the difference between the United States and England over against Europe in the Enlightenment experiment is that for the French philosophers, what lay at the bottom of all of their thinking was rationalism, right? Rationalism, reasoning. So whether you go to Descartes or you go to Voltaire or whatever, it was always reasoning. Although Descartes and all were really churchmen and theists, Voltaire was not. But rationality was at the bedrock of all of their thinking. She says the difference in the Enlightenment of America and England was that moral reasoning was at the bedrock of the American experiment and the United Kingdom. And she gives a whole chapter to John Wesley. Amazing, coming from a writer like that. And so why do we keep asking about love and coherence and meaning and justice? Is because intuitively we know that they are the right things in life. What has happened now is we have dispositioned and mispositioned. We talk so much about human rights, we really don't talk about the right to be human. We do not know how to define what it means to be human. Rights have to come from being right. Rights are not with their feet firmly planted in midair. They have the bedrock on which to stand, that we are created imago Dei. And what has happened with people, for example, a quick illustration, we have time's running out. In a cricket match in England, one of the players cheated. And he was out, but the umpire hadn't seen what actually happened and so gave him not out. And the batsman stayed in his crease and continued to play. Now, cricket is known for being a, quote, gentleman's game. That's why you have the saying, that's not cricket, that's not fair. And when this English player pretended to be not out and stayed on, who tweeted the most nasty insults to that? Richard Dawkins. He said, I'm never going to watch this game again with these guys, the way they are cheating. He should have walked out of there. Somebody wrote to him and said, Richard, it's very consistent with what you believe, the selfish gene, you know.
Amen. There you go, bro.
So, why does he struggle with it? For the same reason Jean-Paul Sartre said his philosophy was unlivable. And the same reason Anthony Flew in his latter years, as though as an albeit full-blown atheist, said he no longer finds it able to live consistently with the vociferous atheistic worldview that we. So my answer to your question is, intuitively we move towards that, cerebrally we try to smother it, and hence the breakdown and the tension within human life. We made the means as the ends in themselves, when God has said there is a greater end for all of us. So, if it's all matter, it really doesn't matter. But behind that matter, there's this soulishness that cries out, give me justice or I die. So by their question, Richard Dawkins, questioned a Christian who couldn't, he said they don't even know the 4 Gospels. How can we really call them Christians? And so the dean of St. Paul's was interviewing him on the BBC, and he said, all right, Richard, since you're criticizing the Christian for not knowing the 4 Gospels, your Bible is Darwin's Origin of Species, isn't it? And he said, yeah, you can call it that. He said, can you give me the whole title? Dawkins goes, yeah, it's a long title. He said, go ahead, Richard. And he went on, he said, I'm sorry, dear God, oh God. He said, oh God, help me remember this. He's trying to remember. The ultimate proof of the sovereignty of God is even an atheist had to call upon him to remind him of the title of a book that said it caused him to disbelieve in him. So there you have it. Okay, all right.
Thank you and God bless.
So here's the final question of this evening, and it's coming by text. If Jesus preaches nothing but love, why do a lot of Christians seem to hate others that aren't Christian?
I appreciate you asking that question, and I really want to affirm it. First, the first half of it, Jesus preaches unconditional love. Let me just affirm that part of the question. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Some of us take some of that for granted now, but it was radically distinctive when Jesus spoke it. And Jesus was a man who, as he was hanging on the cross, looked down at the very people who was crucifying him and said, Father, forgive them. Okay, that's the man that I follow. He said, do to others as you would have them do to you. The golden rule. Again, we take that for granted at times in the context of our culture, but that is radically distinctive to Jesus' words. The closest you can find in history to that is when Confucius said, do not inflict on others what you do not want inflicted on you. That's radically different. One of my colleagues says that's the difference between not punching someone in the face and building someone a hospital. Do to others as you would have them do to you. A radical ethic of love for every single person. So I just want to affirm that. Why do a lot of Christians seem to hate other people? We're broken. We're sinners. I have things going on in my life just like you have things going on in your life. I'm distracted so often. I'm caught up, concerned about whether I'm going to make a mistake when I'm up here in front of all these people. I'm not thinking about the way that I should love the person who's coming through the door and needs a warm greeting, that evening. We put our hands up and accept that as Christians, that we are sinners in need of forgiveness. The Christian community has become my family. Family is such a blessing. I'm so grateful for it. I have seen the very best of community in the context of Christian community. Jesus talks about the fullness of life. The Bible tells us that we're intended for a life of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and generosity and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. When those things characterize a community, and I have seen that in the context of the Christian community, it is utterly, utterly beautiful, and you feel at home. I don't know if you have one place in the world where you feel most at home. You feel at home in the context of that community precisely because of that unconditional love of God, that you know each other person in that community does not put upon you because of your achievements or what you merit or how deserving you are, but simply because you are a child of God, simply because you are created by Him. That's a beautiful thing. But I have also seen Christian community that's broken and that is unhealthy. It is my family. And so I want to say this in full sincerity. If you are here tonight and you have been wronged, you have been hated by a member of my family, of the Christian community, I am sorry. And please, will you forgive me? Will you forgive my family for that? That is in absolute contradistinction to the person that we follow. And I just absolutely hope, if that is the case for you, would you please give us a second chance? Because I have seen community that is home and that has purpose and that is loving as Jesus intended it to be. Why don't I turn over to Ravi and let him speak to this question as well?
I think I'll just make it as a closing statement. Michelle, you've all been very patient with us, and thank you so much for coming. I think I was here about 7 or 8 years ago or something, and we were in one of the arenas there, and nice to be back at this stage of my life. I don't know when I go back anywhere, but I just can only commit to so much. I was sitting here thinking as Vince was giving that answer, I meet people that talk to me privately, and they will hold some pretty key positions in life. I remember one African president putting his arm in mine as we were walking and talking about how his whole country was just falling apart, completely falling apart, and they had no answers. And I'm sitting here looking at the United States and what we are going through. I was in Russia a few weeks ago, and a man took me out for breakfast, and he said, I'll tell you something as a Russian. I always had hope for the future of this world because of America. My whole hope was based on America. He said, now I've lost that hope. And here's what he said in his broken English. They don't think rightly there anymore. They don't think rightly there anymore. Imagine if tomorrow both sides of the aisle's leaders said, let's get together for a morning of prayer and conversation. And let's try to find what's best for this nation and abide by the rule of law and let a sovereign God be in control, and we move forward to build this nation rather than with all the vitriol and the hate. Imagine what it would do to this nation if that happened. But why do we hold out such little hope for something like that? It's because the heart seeks power and control and is desperately wicked. A Pakistani man who was a medical doctor came to Christ. I said to him, how did it happen? He said, I walked into a church meeting in Islamabad, and he said, I hated Christians and I hated Christianity, but a friend of mine took me, and just to satisfy him, I went. He said, I just didn't